Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Garant, and I'm the coordinator with the college's professional practice department. We just want to thank you for joining us for this educational session, Do As I Say, Not As I Do, a cautionary tale of private practice and supervision, presented by Thomas Brown. Thomas Brown is a registered social worker, original founder, and current co-owner of Qualia Counseling Services, an award-winning agency with locations in Waterloo, Brantford, and Six Nations of the Grand River. He's certified by both the Canadian Association of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies and the Academy of Cognitive Therapy. Thomas maintains an active clinical practice and provides clinical supervision and has taught extensively on cognitive behavioral therapy and supervision. Please join me in welcoming Thomas.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Jane, for that lovely introduction. In that introduction, you'll note that Jane gave my very Western introduction, all of the credentials and all of the letters and things behind my name. My business partner, Charity Fleming, is Indigenous, and as you heard, two of our practices, we work almost exclusively with Indigenous clients. And so I've had the honor of learning from Indigenous people, including my partner, and know that a more holistic introduction would also include that I am a father, and I am a husband, and I am a son. This past weekend, I was in Niagara Falls with my daughter for her hockey team, and my husband was with our son in Grand Bend for a rehearsal. So we've been all over the place. And my introduction online, or my bio online, commented that I mostly spend my time in my minivan driving kids around between all the things that they do. Also, quickly, thank you so much for the college for inviting me here. It's been lovely. The hotel is much nicer than the hotel which was in Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls was a little sketchy, but it was lovely here. So thank you for the wonderful treatment. I'll just go ahead and sort of move forward here. I understand that there are many, many people logged online, and I know that there's already been a land acknowledgement. But when I teach online, I often use the chat feature to have people also let us know where they are and to also put their land acknowledgements in the chat, just so we understand where everyone's coming from. So I know we can't do that here, but I spend much of my time, I developed this presentation in Waterloo, and here's our land acknowledgement. And just to acknowledge that I'm sure many of us who are online and even in this room, that we come from all over Ontario and even Canada, and that we are all stewards of the land, and it's very important to acknowledge that. And finally, I'd also like to wish everyone happy Pride, because I am part of that community, and it's exciting and lovely month. I forgot my little rainbow button, but happy Pride to everyone in the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. So the overview of my presentation is, my idea here is to use, I was saying to Jane that I'm going to be talking about my mistakes. I'm going to be talking about how I got into private practice and into supervision, and using my little bit of narrative to sort of talk about what I think is a better practice. And so it's been interesting, actually, even looking at, there's some photos of me that I went through here and thinking about old memories. And I actually have found myself anxious and a little bit worried about this presentation, which is very unlike me. I give a lot of presentations, and I enjoy it, and I'm usually quite comfortable. But I think that sort of goes to my point in my presentation, that I've had to relive some difficult times, some stressful times, some times that, there was great times, and I'll show you some of those pictures and some really lovely parts of this, but it was also a very challenging time of my life. And I think this little bit of nerves, my knees even shaking a little bit right now, speaking of use of self, that I'm kind of encountering again. And I think that's important to just name here that, this is real, right? Doing these things comes with challenges, and I think that we really have to acknowledge that, and certainly is something I'm experiencing in this moment. And I'd like you to listen to my story with your judgy face on, okay? I know we're all social workers, and we take our non-judgmental stance, and you might be hearing strengths, and boy, that Tom has resilience, and that might be true. But I also want you to listen and say, boy, that was a dumb choice. That was too much. That all happened at that time. Why did you keep going? Or why didn't you say no? Or why did you make those decisions? So although, maybe if you want to be nice and say, there's a little bit of resilience, that'd be fine. But I also want you to take a bit of a judgmental stance and use your judgy face to listen to my story and my narrative. All right, so here I am. I was thinking as I was coming here, it's probably almost 16 years to the day that I graduated from Laurier's Masters of Social Work program. A little bit of a different haircut, fewer lines on my face, yes. And just to give you a little bit of background here, so my first career was in music therapy. So I studied music and discovered I was not going to be an opera singer or a piano player. So I went to Laurier for music therapy and then practiced that for several years. And I worked with people with chronic long-term mental health challenges, and then also spent time, the majority of my time in that career working with people with Alzheimer's and dementia. So I had some experience, sitting with people, building that therapeutic rapport. In my mind, my undergrad was fairly rigorous in terms of sort of those clinical techniques. So I had that in my back pocket. But even in this picture, I already had plans to open a private practice with my then business partner. And it had sort of just come by happenstance. Our husbands were colleagues. And so we got chatting about, what could happen after school. She was further along in her social work career. And we got to talking about opening a private practice, which focused specifically on CBT. And, I thought, what a great idea. Sure, let's do it. And so the plans were in place. Even here, I think we were already getting bank loans. We had places in mind to start leasing, and that was in the works and starting at this point here with my pretty flowers. But I didn't know at the time, and this is sort of my first mistake, how much it takes to become a new therapist, to become competent new therapist and good at it, right? Beyond competency. So questions that I started wondering as I was seeing clients and striving to maintain and keep my clients, because this was supposed to be my income, but also to do good clinical work with my clients. And so I was doing the controlled active psychotherapy. Back then it wasn't called that, but I was practicing CBT and working with clients. So I was thinking, how do I use my paradigm? I had these brand new CBT skills. Right after I graduated, I did 2 back-to-back certificates in CBT, driving down here to Oise College for several weeks. So I had these new skills. How do I do that? How do I kind of make sure I'm doing it right, but also seeing my clients as they are? How do I maintain my clients? That was a big thing. I've discovered that if you chase something, it runs. So if I was sort of I don't think I ever said, please come back, but it was, this sort of this sentiment that I really would like you to come back, and I would lose clients or they would choose to go somewhere else. How do I work with issues beyond my basic experience? So that's scope of practice. How do I know I'm doing a good job at all? And what about my own mental health? What about all of this other stuff? And then, of course, the use of self, countertransference, all of these other pieces that needed to come in. Those are the questions I was asking myself as I was seeing clients and trying to, run this private practice. Oh yeah, and what about ethics, right? What about ethics? And I think probably here would be another mistake. It probably was not that ethical to be seeing clients on my own early on like that. Do as I say, not as I do. And then beyond that, I think we can start looking to literature and looking to research to help us understand what actually does it take to become a competent therapist. If we look at developmental models, which there are several of them, these 3 models, I'm most familiar with the first one, but these other 2 are similar in that they sort of think about and conceptualize the development of us as therapists in phases, for better or for worse, right? And you move through your initial sort of novice stages, you become better and better, and then eventually, hopefully, you become more expert and beyond competent in your work. And I think the important thing here, that just to sort of flesh this out a bit and to sort of talk about how much it takes to become a new clinician, this IDM model looks at sort of a 3-phase developmental plan and these 8 domains. So these are all of these elements that we need to think about as new clinicians, right? I won't read these all out. You're all able to do that. But assessment, intervention skills, professional ethics, treatment plans and goals, all of these things, use of self, transference, countertransference, all of these pieces that really require us to focus and learn about them. And it's no small feat. Right? And this might be with what they call, a simple client, whatever that is. But if we get more complicated clients or we're on our own, that's a lot to take on as a new clinician. And then, of course, I have, or if we're working in an organization or I have some difficult clients or there's operational issues, all of that can add to it as well. So my point again is it's a lot to become a new therapist. And coming fresh out of school, you might, like I was, I had my shiny new degree, wet behind the ears, thinking you can do it, but it takes a lot. And if we look at some other models, you know, that talk more about how we develop, you don't just develop by getting experience. So even though you move through these phases, that might not mean that you're getting better and better. You know, I could have sat there and continued to make the same mistakes over and over again. Or if I'm trying to become a really good artist, you know, do the same thing over and over again. So it actually takes some of these other types of models that I'm naming up here that focus more on how do you get better. And you can sort of see where we're beelining towards supervision here, but we need to be challenged. We need people to look at our work. We need people to say what we're doing well, get kind of boosted up, absolutely, but also where we're kind of coming up short. And then it's through that that we actually then can, in a functional way, move through those developmental phases. So it doesn't just happen on its own. So for myself, I did start to engage with some supervision. I knew that I was not probably at my best. I knew that I needed to work on things. And so I hired a supervisor that was actually one of my professors at school. And looking back on it, she knew what was going on. I needed therapy. I needed someone to help me with my low self-worth. I was, you know, this is the first time I was doing something that felt really important to me. It was a goal of mine to become a social worker like this. And I was so, just so aware of how incompetent I was. In fact, that would have been one of the phrases going through my mind, you're not competent. So I hired a supervisor. We called it supervision, but I spent a lot of time crying. And she worked me through different kind of interventions, and it was very helpful at that time. And so speaking of, you know, development, we have to be able to get to a point where we're asking ourselves or asking, you know, maybe our supervisees, you know, when is it okay to be, you know, to be dependent or independent, I mean. You know, some of these are the higher level skills. How can you tolerate uncertainty, right? When we're moving from sort of rigidly using, say, a protocol or an approach or an idea to using it more artistically. You know, how effective are we with our reflection, with consultation? You know, do we know how to use supervision? So these are the types of things that we want to start seeing. Maybe if we're supervisors or if we're working with students or something like that, that these are the things that we start to sort of see and go, okay, this person might start being ready to be more independent, maybe open a private practice, maybe. I do a lot of teaching with supervisees, students, and my own therapists alike. And I often think about it when I talk about it as moving from sort of a paint by number to an expert artist, right? We call it a practice because these are skills we need to practice. I have a ton of adages when people work with me, they got kind of roll their eyes, but one of mine is all information is good information. So we need to be able to know what we're seeing and work with it. But another one is we need to learn the rules so we can break them properly. And working, you know, from within my paradigm of CBT, or if we're using other approaches or our organization has approaches, we need to use those well and learn them well enough that we can then artistically break those rules and do something on the other side of that. And we have to know how to break them as well, right? So again, becoming a therapist is no small feat. I thought that was a good idea, but it really wasn't. And, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that impacted me. But I think it's important as well for us, if we're thinking about getting supervision, how do we get the most out of it? It's way more than just sort of coming with a case or some broad ideas to your supervisor. We need to, you know, we need to come ready to learn and work as supervisees. And if we're supervisors, expecting a lot out of our supervisees, you know, doing more than, you know, bring a case and tell me about it. You know, it behooves both parties within a supervisory relationship to really kind of work at this. So I don't know if I agree with this quote 100%, but I do like the sentiment here that, you know, a supervisee needs to take the bull by the horns, and especially if you're being, you know, hiring someone privately, to, you know, get the most out of that experience. Come prepared, bring recordings, come with questions, bring a full case analysis so that you are able, and send it ahead of time to your supervisor so that they can come prepared as well for supervision. I think it's really easy, especially, and I know this, I'm speaking from personal experience, to, you know, just sometimes my supervisees come, oh, who am I going to talk about? They're scoring through their caseload. Oh, I guess I can talk about this. That drives me bonkers because it's just so wishy-washy. We can do much better, more efficient work when we come more prepared and ready to go. So Podetsky has, I've got a reference list at the end here. She has some a few articles and things on her website about how to get the best out of supervision, but this is a really good one. Come prepared with a focused question. That's something I require of my supervisees. Who's the person you're going to talk about? So out of some demographic information that would be important for me to know. What's your focus or question beyond I'm stuck? Right? And then I'll also give my supervisees some sort of thought experiments or some reflection exercises so that they can work through some things before they bring it to supervision. All right? I know recordings makes everyone's heart sink. And we all have to get over the fact that our voices actually sound like that. Yes, they do. Once you can get over that, recordings are such a valuable way to learn. And, again, as supervisors, to hold our supervisees' feet to the fire and ask for recordings, encourage recordings. Probably you can't force them if you're hired privately, but if, to let them know that would be a way better use of your money if you have me listen to a tape and it can give you feedback. And for supervisees, get brave. Record some work. You can keep it confidential. I actually like just audio recordings over video recordings. Usually a video, you're just getting a shot up someone's nose and it's not very helpful. But audio recordings, I think there's a lot of value in that. And there's a lot of easy ways to do it these days with our great, cell phones and things like that. Ask for corrective feedback, absolutely. Try to be specific in your goal setting. Practice between sessions, right? That's a really important piece. We learned in my previous slides, you can sit in supervision and listen to something, and this is the thing with our clients, isn't it? But we have to put it into practice as we're working. Discuss your own reactions, so your own self. Be honest with your mistakes. And I think this is a really tough one. I talk about this a little bit when I talk about the supervisory relationship. Supervision has that hierarchy, often has a hierarchical element in it, which can make it not 100% safe for supervisees to bring mistakes forward, but that's where the good stuff is. So as supervisors, it really behooves us to try to create psychological safety so that so our supervisees can bring mistakes forward, and for supervisees to, again, be brave. Sure, maybe bring some good stuff. I often ask my supervisees, first give me a great recording where you're so proud of yourself. I want to hear that. I want to celebrate with you. And then, because I know you're good and I just want you to prove it to yourself. And then let's start looking at the hard stuff, because that's where we're going to get the learning. Try to use data. It doesn't always work, but if you've got a scale or some sort of way to get some feedback in a concrete way, that's great. And make sure that you are matching your supervision with your developmental stage. So if you're brand new, there's a little bit of a different approach that a supervisor would take than if you're well advanced in your career. I think that stands to reason, but you want to sort of look for that in your supervisors. And yeah, be open and ask questions. Work hard on this, because this is important. All right, back to this guy with his flowers and his different hair. So at the same time, I already talked about this, but at the same time that I was getting my brand new shiny diploma or my master's work there, I was also opening Qualia Counseling Services, which has been open for 16 years now. And I was just dumb. I didn't know what I didn't know, right? Sure, let's jump into this. Let's start learning about all the things that I have to start learning about. Incorporating, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Getting a bank loan, that sounds like a great idea. Probably should do that. Registration, finding a place to lease. I'm working with my then business partner, and how is that relationship going? All of these things were coming at play. So parallel kind of learning there. And again, it's not a good idea. It's really hard, and it was stressful, and my mental health was suffering, and I was trying my best, but it was just a little too much to take on at that time. So let's look at what it takes, and these are just sort of some of the things off the top of my head that it takes to to open up a private practice, And I was drawing on our college has some information, and also some of the associations of social work as well. So I wasn't just making this up. This was coming from people who know things. So this is just a list of stuff to start thinking about. Am I competent to work before I open this practice, right? And we thought about some of those questions we thought about before. Can I handle, uncertainty? Am I learning? Do I know the rules so I can break the rules? These kinds of things. And I think this is a really important one, that there is competence before entrepreneurship. And in a room of social workers, I know that for me at least, entrepreneurship and a business mind is not an automatic marriage to social work. In fact, it's a little bit contrary to start thinking about paying, to start thinking about, I'm going to charge people for this. That wonderful non-judgmental stance can become problematic when we are working with employees who have to follow some HR policies and things like that. My office manager to this day says I'm too soft. I need to I need to put a line in the sand more. But Farron would always say, "Oh, Tom, you're way too soft." Again, because it's hard. Those are two separate kind of ways of thinking that you have to somehow reconcile with different hats. Practicing within your scope of practice, sure, that's a really big one. But then all of this stuff about liability and insurance. And, I can tell stories about one time there was a client who was brought by a caregiver to our office. For some reason, in the parking lot, she got out of the caregiver, not our client, got out of the car and somehow got bonked on the head by the parking arm, right? And she came in kind of ready to blame and said, well, who can I talk to about the injury I've just sustained and who's responsible and stuff like that? They don't teach you this stuff in social work school. Promise. They don't teach you this stuff also in business school. Like I don't have a business degree. I have a master's in leadership, but that doesn't show up there. And you kind of have to be able to, as you're working with your clients, also be managing these eventualities that you can't prepare for entirely, right? Uncertainty is just a part of life and we have to kind of roll with it. So you start, writing policies and procedures. How does supervision work into your private practice? How do you advertise yourself? Some of my competitors in Waterloo are spending upwards of $10,000 a month on Google ads. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So if you're opening a private practice and you want to use online advertising, it is pricey. And to get those ads, if you're scrolling and it shows up, that's a lot of money. Did you know that, right? And if you want to compete out there with the other agencies in town, I don't know what it's like in Toronto. This is in Waterloo, which is a little smaller, right? So just interesting things to know. Any kind of business considerations, strategy, what's your mission? What's your vision? What do you hope to accomplish out of this work you're doing? How big do you want to grow? Do you want to grow? All of this stuff to think about while you're also seeing clients, because that's what's putting money on in the bank account, right? Business is about money. A private practice is about money. And I know that probably, it doesn't make me feel great, but if you don't have money in the bank account, the lights go out and you can't hire people and then you can't provide any kind of counseling or psychotherapy. So it's a real, for us social workers, it's a bit of it messes with your brain a bit because that's so important. And no one likes to talk about money, but you have to, right? Are you going to do psychotherapy? That's a whole nother kettle of fish. Keeping on top of any kind of privacy legislation, that's changing. And it's really important to, know about that. We work with kids and the number of times we're sort of working through the ethical dilemma of, do parents get to know information? Does this young person able to consent for their own care? Angry parents who are divorcing and using the kid as liability in between. That's a huge part of the work you do. And it's not easy. Again, ethical self-reflection, more legal considerations, taxes. Oh my God, yeah, you have to have a good accountant, and knowing about HST and knowing if you'd have to charge HST and all these things. I've talked about a bit of crisis planning and safety. Do you have to get everybody trained in WMIS? You have to make sure there's a health and safety plan and a bulletin board, and they have to know where the first aid kits are. All of this stuff that needs to go. I hope I'm kind of scaring people, because it's a big undertaking. And you don't do this while you're a new therapist. It's just too much, I don't have hard research on that. I have my life experience. It's too much to try to learn that. Technology is a big one now, right? I did some training in probably about 6 years ago. I was doing with the Chamber of Commerce because I wanted to get more kind of business savvy. So I thought I'd join this business of commerce thing, and it got the pants scared off me about cybersecurity. So then I hired a cybersecurity guy who now all of a sudden all of our phones and our computers have to have endpoint security on them, which costs a lot of money. Back to money, right? And then how do I keep everybody from making sure they don't use their phones at work and all this kind of stuff? You can go on forever and ever. yes, social justice and accessibility, conflicts of interest, especially in smaller locations, which happens, right? If we're here in Toronto and even Waterloo, rarely do I sort of cross paths with people. It does happen from time to time, but in smaller locations, I know I've talked to people from all over Ontario, and their pharmacist is their client because it's just small. There's no other options, right? Of course, we have the virtual world, and that helps. But back to even technology, where does AI fit in? Who uses Jane and has tried their AI notes? Pretty fancy. It works great. But people get worried about where that's stored. And I know Jane would say it's fine. That's what they said to me. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on with AI and how to use that. So I think I read this, and I think this is on our college website. It's not an entry-level competency. It's just not to open a private practice. I even think it's challenging to, I think what's really common, well, I know what's really common right now is you graduate and then you go in as a private practitioner within an agency, right? You're a contractor, and I do the same thing. That's the kind of this norm right now. Even that's tricky because you still have to think about your bottom line, your schedule, you have to get a good accountant, you have to set your schedule. Even that's challenging. So be aware that I think that's probably what a lot of people are doing, and I think there's support there, but I think that can be challenging as well. And again, I think you're hearing me kind of loud and clear. These are two entirely different worlds. The business world and your counseling world or your social work world, I can't say that, are very different beasts and require very different skill acquisition to work that through. So here I am again. This is in my little office, a day that we are moving. So we grew quite quickly. And this is in 2012. So 2 years after we opened, we were moving to a larger location. Yeah, everyone's like, well, look at him. Another new hair again, sitting there. And sure, I'm smiling, but I'll let you know that I was struggling back then, for sure. A lot of my own kind of mental health stuff. I was challenged with my stress, challenged with trying to do a good job. It was exciting to be moving. We had a new space. We had designed it. There was a lot of money, more loans. We learned about the word leasehold improvements. Do you know what that word means? It makes it, yeah, people are know. Well, if you're going to open a private practice, that's like making your offices nice. And sometimes you pay for it. Sometimes they roll it into the lease. Sometimes they amortize it. I'm just throwing that out there because there's a lot to learn. I would say my mental health was in terrible shape. My physical health wasn't great. And I have not asked my husband how I was back then, but I think he would probably say, yeah, that wasn't the best time of your life. That was hard. And I also felt pretty alone and isolated because when you own your own private practice and you're, for lack of a better word, the boss, you can't go to your colleagues and your friends and say, man, I'm really struggling, or this place is stressing me out, and we're going further and further into debt, because you're a leader, right? And you need to tell your people, yeah, we're doing fine, and you don't want to be inauthentic or dishonest, but that's your job to sort of steer the ship. And so that too leaves you feeling quite isolated. And of course, I could talk to my business partner, and I did, obviously talk to my husband. But it's a tough road to be on, and our work is naturally isolating, right? We're sitting by ourselves in offices, and confidentiality, of course, needs to be respected. So we were growing, and I was struggling, but still kind of soldiering on. That's ADP calling. They've been calling forever, wanting to bring me on for payroll, and I keep on ignoring them. That just happened. That happens all the time when you own a business. You tell one person that you might be thinking about ADP, and they never leave you alone. So in real time here, right? All right, so back to me. I'm sort of not doing that great, trying my best, continuing to learn. It was right around this time I changed to a different supervisor because I was worried about my CBT skills. I went and hired a guy from the States through the Beck Academy, and he kicked my butt. There was, how I cried with my other supervisor? That was because of all emotional stuff. I cried over here because there was no space for emotion. So I came back after my first session to my husband. I'm like, this was terrible. Sounds like I cry a lot. I actually don't, but maybe I did back then for other reasons. But I had to send a tape down every week for 10 weeks straight. He would rate it with the cognitive therapy rating scale. We would have a meeting and he'd talk it through, and I'd have to try new things. We followed. So it was very rigorous, kicked my butt. It was really stressful. But that was what I was trying to do to improve my skill as a psychotherapist and as a CBTer. And of course, learning's hard. And so that was just sort of another stress in that time. It was also at that time when I was trying to get credited with the academy. And so there was a big process around that I was working at as well. So opening a private practice, I think ongoing supervision. Well, how do we do that? Ongoing supervision there as well. I would recommend some therapy. We all need it, right? We all need it. And so I certainly did. And I did not access it enough. I think back then it was easier to say I need supervision than therapy. And I would always say in my teaching around supervision that supervision has therapeutic elements to it, but is not therapy. And so I think I could have used some, straight up therapy, how you doing? I was doing some of my own kind of personal work. It might not be a bad idea to move, if you're doing some private practice work, to think about some career coaching or some business coaching. And that's another whole world. Coaches are not regulated, and you can't charge your insurance company for coaching sessions. But that might be really helpful. Banks and other organizations can be helpful and give you a lot of support. The Business Development Bank of Canada, over the course of our business, has been very, very helpful, and they're a great organization, so I'd recommend them. You might want to think about a mentor, right? Someone who could help you through some of these things, and maybe by now, hopefully by now, you're advanced in your career, so kind of a mentorship relationship would be helpful. And I'd also really recommend peer support. So I do now meet once a month with a group of other people who own private practices across the GTA and all the way over to Ajax. Some of them are my colleagues from Laurier days. One guy was a student of mine and now has a practice. And that's just a great way to sit down and gripe a bit, but also share ideas. Jane Payments, we're switching to them from Moneris because they offered us a deal. So if you're in a private practice, Jane has been very helpful. I'll let you know how it turns out. We're networking. That's what that's called. Okay. And then finally, and then we're going to get to even one other little piece here. I'm going quicker than I thought, but that's okay. More questions. Clinical supervision. So if we're sort of thinking about the evolution of a career, you graduate with your master's and you need to be in your private practice, or not, I just stepped on my own toe there. You need to be developing your work for a good chunk of time before you would ever think about opening a private practice. And maybe around that same time, you're maybe thinking about clinical supervision as a career kind of naturally develops. But supervision is, again, maybe not entirely, but quite a unique set of skills. Just because you're a good football player doesn't mean you're a good football coach. Just because you're a good therapist doesn't mean you're a good supervisor. There's some very different elements there. And I think ideally, in terms of sort of the definition of supervision, it's typically sort of a more senior person working with a more junior person. And I know in my teaching around supervision in lots of smaller settings, and not even such small settings, sometimes people are sort of promoted or brought into supervisory roles where that's sort of different, that's reversed a little bit, and that sometimes happens. But we need to be advanced in our career to be able to provide supervision. So here it is, this definition that I tend to use. And there are certain elements within supervision that we have to get comfortable with, like this evaluative and hierarchical role. I know that makes us social workers a little itchy because we try to mitigate power, right? We try to find people, meet them where they're at. But when you're working, especially with students, at the end of that placement, you get to say whether they pass or fail. You're a gatekeeper. That's built into supervision. And we have to be able to reckon that with our own kind of thinking and our own work. The relationships are slightly different, and we have a variety of purposes that make up what supervision is. And yes, there's a lot of style, your own sort of approach. How personal are you going to be? How directive? How structured? How open? But again, if you sort of think about the purpose of teaching, we are gatekeepers for the profession as supervisors. We're wanting to enhance social work, and in my case, psychotherapy. You want to train and have people that you're proud to have these people graduate and go out into the field. You want to feel confident in them. And so to use supervision well and to expect more of your supervisees and have your supervisees do the work is a great way to go if you can. And I know organizations don't always allow this specifically, but it's an important piece. And again, it's a late career step in my mind. Boy, those are some little words. Can you see them? Yeah. Sorry about that. Some small on mine too. Maybe the people at home can make their screens bigger. So this is coming from our social work world. I was talking to Jane that our sister organization, the CRPO, has much stricter rules around supervision and when you can supervise and what the requirements are. But what we've got, sort of a minimum foundation of experience, is what we have. We have to have a registration in good standing, obviously, and some good clinical experience. It's not really defined for how long that should be. Demonstrated competence. What does that mean? That's a little loose, but we could wonder about that. Maybe our clients are telling us we're doing a good job. Maybe we're using some scales to say, yeah, that's looking pretty good. We need to have some quality supervision ourselves. And strongly recommended to, I'm going to have to read up here, formal education and supervision models. There's a lot of training now. When I started in 2016, sorry, it's 2010, my brain. I wouldn't say there was a lot of training in supervision, where there is quite a lot now, online especially. We can get quite a lot. So some training, some reading. It's great to know some of the developmental models of supervision and those practices of supervision. We need training in how do we give feedback and evaluation. Those are skills that we need to work. How do I, challenge you and give you some difficult feedback without shutting you down, with maintaining psychological safety, so that we can continue talking about it. Of course, knowledge and ethics, the ongoing cases, and then an advanced supervisor, some characteristics there. We have to teach our clinical skills, facilitate reflective practice. That's a best practice across the board. And to manage and think about power differentials, of course. How to give good feedback. And I think within all of this as well is how do we work with cultural difference as well. That's a huge piece of this. And I think too, when I think about and talk about supervision, I'm thinking about my stance in private practice. People hire me privately, or I'm working with contractors. I know there's a whole nother world when you're working in organizations, right? That will have clinical supervision is often sort of squished together with administrative supervision. You have to talk about your numbers and your statistics and your quotas for the month, for the week. Oh, and also let's talk about a case, or whether it fits in or not. Or hospitals are swamped all the time. Do we have time for supervision? Or maybe it's just or schools, right? So that's sort of another piece of all of this, is how do you do this in various contexts? And then of course, various contexts with cultural considerations and background. Moving into supervision, man, I chose small fonts. Why? Yeah, so this is in good, so this is from the CRPO. So they give a much more strict definition. And if you're working with the CRPO and supervising their folks, you need to have these things. They have it quite clearly on their website. So good standing with your own college. Social workers can supervise RPQs, RP qualifying. You can supervise them. I'll talk about the caveat there in just a sec. They need at least 5 years experience, and they have a certain number of hours of clinical experience that they want you to have there. We can see it here, over 1,000 hours, and 150 hours of clinical supervision. And I'm not going to read all that, but there's sort of what they expect. The thing that's changed now, just if you're interested, I have worked a lot with RP students out of Yorkville. There's a lot of them coming out of there. And yes, you can a registered social worker can supervise RPQs, but they're changing when they can become qualifying. So where the students were getting that Q partway through their placement, they now cannot get that till they're done their placement. And so that essentially means that if any students are still in school, if you care at all, and you're an RSW, you won't be able to supervise them while they're in their school placement. So I don't know if that makes you happy or mad or what, but that's what I've learned, okay? So I've said this a couple times and hope I'm not making too fine a point on it. This is a late career development. I know that sometimes we move into it earlier out of necessity. Maybe the organization is small and we're promoted. However, that means you're needing to learn a whole new kind of area of skills. And I would say I supervised too early. Jane and I were talking a bit beforehand, and because I had moved into hiring my private practice and we had brought contractors on, there was sort of a necessity to provide, or we felt it important to provide some education and some support and things like that. So early on, we did probably what I would call sort of peer consultation work. We would bring cases and all workshop them together. And then I knew that I was not equipped yet to supervise. So after that kick butt supervision experience that I had, I actually took some time just before COVID to get that 30 hours of training and to do quite a lot of supervision, self-education, so that I felt I was ready to actually supervise with some integrity. And I was also saying to Jane that my first supervisee was really interested in being quite specific around developing CBT. And so I told him, well, you're going to be my guinea pig if you're okay with that. And I charged him like basically nothing, I think $20 a pop. And I said, we're going to learn this together. You're going to be my first supervisee, and we're going to hope you tell me how I'm doing. And we figured it out. So that was, my own kind of practicum placement, I guess. And that worked out quite well, that I learned some of the stuff there. And then from there was sort of developed my skills ongoing. But again, all of that sort of layered on at the same time is just far, far too much for any person. All right, and what about a personal life, right? Because that happens too. So, right, that's my little Davy. So that same month, this had just happened by fluke, that it was going through my master's work. Mike and I, my husband, were also applying to adopt. And in that same month, David showed up in our lives. So yeah, I know. It was nuts. Do as I say, not as I do. So he showed up in June. We learned about him. And by the middle of July, David had moved in. And he was 8 months and amazing and so cute. He's now 16 and less cute and still amazing, and for a variety of reasons. Teenagers, we're learning about that. He's driving and stuff like that. But let's just sort of go back and think, all right, learning to be a new therapist, learning how to run a business, I had no idea, making that all up as I go, sort of falling into supervision, far too much. Remember, use your judgy voices, right? Judgy faces, and then becoming a new dad. Craziness. Looking back now, for sure, oh, there's ADP again, yeah. No, that's my son. See, in real time, it happens in real time. And I would usually not answer, but I'm actually doing that on purpose, just so you know. I'm being professional, but letting you know this all does happen in real time, right? So if you are doing anything, life will come at you, right? If you're my age, you've got older parents and younger kids, or your house floods, or your car crashes, or you get an illness. And there needs to be space for that to also occur. And when your plate is completely full with just learning to be a new therapist or opening a private practice, life very quickly becomes way, way too much. And I think we often talk about balance, right? And I think we need to do more than talk about it, because I would really, I think about professional competence, and that can be sort of a question, right? Am I able to do this work right now? I think we can do a pretty good job when we self-reflect and say, for me, for example, I would have a hard time working with a perpetrator of childhood sexual abuse. That would be something I'd have to say no to. I had a client consult me and sit down with me, and he said, he was sort of dealing with anxiety, and it sounded maybe, of course we don't diagnose, but maybe a little bit of OCD, and he was worried about being gay. And he told me, and I'm very Christian, and I think being gay is a sin, and I think that quite strongly. He said that to my face. And so I said, well, I am gay. I don't usually disclose that piece of me, but I don't know if I'm going to be the best therapist for you. So I think we're pretty good often at sort of knowing professionally where the lines are for ourselves. But I think we have a harder time when we sort of say, all right, I'm stressed at home, or, I'm caring for parents. Yeah, I see people pointing at themselves, right? I'm caring for my mom, or I'm ill. When my dad died in 2022, I was ready to go. I said, I think I'll go back in a couple of weeks. My business partner, Charity, said, no, we're going to book you off for a month. And I'm so glad she did, because I didn't know that he was the first close person to pass in my life. And the grieving process was astonishing and something so different than I'd expected. And I was so grateful for that time to be able to have that space to grieve. So my point here again is that if we need space for all of these things in our lives. And if I think back to, how I parented David at that time, how I was as a partner to my husband, how I was a partner to my then business partner, how I was to my clients, I really don't know. I mean, I think I did okay, but everyone's still around, most people. And my clients didn't, bring me to the college here, at least no one told me, so that's good. But if I look back, I'm not feeling as nervous now as I did at the start, but it was interesting, as I said, to pull up these pictures and to encounter these memories and go, man, that was tough. That was a hard time. Remembering how hard I worked, and I'd run and make casseroles and run to practice. And Mike's mom and dad came and took care of David for a little while. We cobbled it all together and it worked. But it wasn't easy. And I wouldn't say it was a lot of fun. So if you're considering any of this, my best advice to you from my wizened 47 years of life would be to let things evolve over time. Start your work as a social worker, whether you're doing community work or individual work, allow that to develop, get supervision. Maybe you can work in an organization that's built in. And then as you develop, then start layering on these other things, because of course you're going to want to probably find a spouse, probably get into the housing market, live a life that's meaningful for you, travel, and all of that has to fit in as well. And if it sort of too much too fast, the mental health struggles and relational struggles will come. And I think ultimately too, you really start thinking about, am I able to do this work well when it's too much? So the title of my talk, Do As I Say, Not As I Did, I hope stands. Thank you for listening and letting me reminisce a little bit. And I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Thomas. So we now have time for some questions. So as a reminder, attendees can enter their questions through the chat feature on the right-hand side of their screen. And the chat feature is only available for those accessing the session on a computer or tablet. So not computer or laptop, not from a phone or tablet. I'm going to start us off with a few questions. First, do you have any tips, tricks, or suggestions for registrants looking to obtain supervision and what to look for in a supervisor? So perhaps focusing on different points in someone's career, such as new graduate, early career, or experienced provider.
Sure. Yeah. I think some things in finding a supervisor are not unlike finding a therapist. So trying to sort of I tell people to shop around for a therapist, so shop around a little bit for a supervisor. That supervisory relationship, just like a therapeutic relationship, is absolutely paramount for the work to happen. So I know in maybe a 15-minute consult, you won't get the full breadth of how a person works, but I would sort of shop around and see if you can sort of get a good feel for someone. I offer, free meet and greets with a supervisee before I get started, just to sort of feel that out. I think if you're looking for supervision, kind of like my slide said, do some thinking about what you hope to get out of it beyond getting better, right? If there are certain skills you're looking for, if there's a certain paradigm you want, I know within things like EFT and IFS and stuff like that, there's required supervision built into that. That's not the same, obviously, for all paradigms. But if you are thinking about something specific like that, sort of go in knowing that that's what you want, so you can ask your supervisor about that. I don't work a ton with kids, so if someone wants kid supervision, I'm not your man. I don't do IFS, so I'm not your guy for that either, right? So as a supervisor, know where your lines are, and if you're looking for supervision, also know what you're kind of looking for there. Of course, you want to look at price and stuff like that, and if you can work virtually or not, all of those kind of logistic pieces. And I think also just to be aware that supervision does change as you develop. So often if we're brand new, we do require a little bit more structure, a little bit more hand-holding. That's how it is. We're newbies and we want to learn those skills. And it's not uncommon as you develop to maybe kind of move more into sort of consultation groups or peer groups where you're maybe all kind of that expert level or that more advanced level. so that you can all kind of benefit from each other's experience. There can be value to have like a dyad where there's someone very new and someone more experienced, but that can pretty easily get lopsided. So if you're going to go into groups, kind of look for a homogeneity that will work for you and have clear goals around that as well.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to, there's not a lot of questions in the chat, but people are really resonating with your candor and your vulnerability, and they're really appreciating your talk, feeling validated, especially some folks who are new grads and thinking about moving into private practice. So I just wanted to give you that feedback, real-time feedback. It's ADP calling.
Shut up.
Another question I would have for you would be, what were some indicators for you when you felt competent to provide clinical supervision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking about that just before the presentation. For me, one of my core values is integrity. And so what that meant is it's sort of ironic that I say that and just jumped into all these things, but I think I knew that I felt ready to do intentional sort of one-on-one supervision after I did that intentional training. Then I felt like some of the stuff that I was sort of doing on the fly and sort of cobbled together on my own, based on my own experience and strengths and things like that, felt validated, and I had more kind of tools and ideas and theories in mind that really helped to solidify what I thought I could bring to a supervisory relationship in a supervisory context. And I think that that kind of newbie supervisee that I worked out with, I think that was really important as well, that I could sort of test my skills with him, and he was open to letting me do that. And we both kind of learned together. I think it was very generous of him, and that helped me to feel more confident as well.
Great. Do you still obtain your own supervision or peer consultation?
I try. Yeah. Sometimes I hire someone to do supervision of my supervision. I did that for a little while, and that was very helpful. My peer consultation group that I mentioned, I see them once a month, and we sort of talk more about business practices. Within my agency, we strive to have sort of monthly supervision kind of groups and conversations. And so I feel I kind of benefit out of that. But now that you name it, I should probably hire a supervisor again and see what I can learn. Yeah. So I think, ongoing learning is always important. I've done some other formal education recently, so that helped. So I think kind of that stance of ongoing learning, whether it's reading or supervision or your own therapy, again, is really critical for our work.
Great. What are some things that might happen if you don't agree with your supervisor?
Snack down, Russell. Well, that's bound to happen. In fact, I think you should expect it to happen. And I hope that would sort of be built into the beginning of the supervisory relationship, where I often have a contract, quote unquote. It's not super formal, but sort of a agreement between the two of us around, what are your responsibilities? What are my responsibilities? How are we going to do evaluation? Will there be recording? So that kind of moves that there. But I also will talk about, if and when there is tension between us, how are we going to manage that? Let's put it on the table as an expectation that probably one day we won't agree 100%. And so we can talk a little bit about that. I think as a supervisor, it's important for us to have experience and maybe even some ideas and theories and models around how to manage conflict and do it well. And as a supervisee, I would hope that you, number one, are feeling safe enough to bring your concerns and questions forward. And if you're not, that you might want to think about whether that is the right supervisor for you. And then also be brave enough to bring it forward. Because I think, my adage, all information is good information. If my supervisee is disagreeing with me, I would like to talk about that. I would like to work with them around that. Back to the integrated developmental model, when a new therapist has moved from that kind of newbie time into more of an experienced time, kind of like a teenager, you can expect there to be a little bit more tension because just like a teenager, a new, someone in that phase of development will sort of say, I think I know what I'm doing here. And they probably do. But there might be another approach or a better approach. And there could be a little bit of that sort of tension, just like with a teenager. I want to be a little bit more independent, but maybe you're not quite ready. So you trial something. And so there can be a time when you can expect it a bit more. But again, I would hope that the supervisor has sort of a way to work with it and manage it. And just finally, if it does become problematic within my contract, I also have it built in that if we are at an impasse, here's who we will turn to. Charity, my business partner. And if you're in an organization, hopefully there's someone else that you can say, all right, we're going to go to the next person up or the boss or whatever to help as a third party around this. If you hire someone privately, you can just fire them and go find someone else.
Do you have any recommendations for how to find supervisor training or formal processes or
Well, Google. I think they're pretty good. I mean, shameless plug. For Laurier has a supervision certificate program, and I do a bit of teaching there. So that's not a bad idea. I don't want to name too many names, but if you do just go online, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that you can sort of find what works for you. A lot of stuff obviously is online now and virtual, so you can take that on. You do, again, according to the CRPO, you need those formal hours, but it can also be self-directed. So you can read some books and do some online portals and things like that, and that can also count.
Were there any tools, templates, or resources that you use to create your consent, confidentiality, intake, and session documents?
Oh, now you're asking me to think back to 2010. So the short answer is probably not. We probably just made that up, but that's not a good idea. Do as I do, not as I say. I know that there are a lot of organizations now that will have templates already for you. So whether it's through your bank, whether it's through your insurance, I think the OASW has some private practice documentation. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can use. I know we all have different feelings about ChatGPT and AI, but that's not a bad place to start. I'd really recommend that if you are opening a private practice and you're starting to look at some of this type of paperwork, that you also have a good lawyer that takes a look at it as well and validates and makes sure that it's up to snuff. People can put stuff in there. I've seen some contracts that are just ridiculous and you can't enforce them at all. So you want to make sure that if you're creating things on your own, that you'll run it by your lawyer. And that's another piece if you've got a private practice, you need a lawyer. A good one.
Are you available for online supervision from outside of Ontario?
Email me and we can talk. Yeah.
How might you approach a supervisor who may not be as active or hands-on with you, in session or as in connection with you as much as you may need?
I think that kind of connects with the previous question, whether there's a disagreement or there's a misalignment with how it's going. And I think that's particularly challenging for a supervisee, given that hierarchical element of the work. So I would, again, hope that you could bring that forward to your supervisor and have a good conversation about that. I think that when we teach about supervision and when we get started with supervision, we talk a lot about the contract, and it sounds kind of boring, but it's really important. In fact, that's a really integral part of creating psychological safety so that people can sort of say, all right, here's what I can expect. And if within that, if it is written in there that there'll be observation or there'll be this much supervision in the month or something like that, that's not a bad thing for a supervisor to bring forward to a supervisee to bring forward to their supervisor to say, this is sort of what I was expecting and I'm not getting what I was hoping. And then I would hope that the supervisor could, adjust that. That might come down to style, and that might also come down to the time that the supervisor has. And so us as supervisors, I'll often say you really have to want to supervise because it's doesn't pay you and it can take a lot of time. And when it gets complicated, it can get quite complicated. So you have to be quite mindful and intentional in that. And so it might, require some really good self-reflection on our part as supervisors. Do I have the space both in my mind and soul and emotional world to do this? And do I have the actual time to give a supervisee, especially if they're very, very new?
What are some indicators that you think might show that somebody who's been practicing in an agency post-graduation might be ready for private practice?
Mm-hmm. So I think sort of what I mentioned what I would look for is I would want them to have experience, not just a couple of clients. I would hope that they would have, that 5 years experience isn't necessarily the right metric, but I mean, that's a bit of an indicator. How many hours have you had doing the work? I would want to see from them that they are able to sort of use their basic therapy skills and whatever paradigm that they're using in that artistic, creative, flexible way, that they have some ability to conceptualize and case plan and that is effective. I also hope that there would be, in terms of feedback, that we are getting good indicators from client feedback, good indicators from peer feedback that this person is doing some good work. So I think those would be some things. And I'd sort of look, if I was supervising them, I'd probably, it would be a bit subjective, but kind of look for that sense of maturity to be able to go on and do the work. I actually, with my peer group, talked to one guy who was my student. Now he's moved and he's open to practice here on Bloor Street. And he said, if I'd known it would have been this hard, I wouldn't have done it. He said, I'm happy I'm doing this. It's a good challenge and stuff like that, but it's hard. I wish I would have stayed at the university and had a job like that. That would have been easier than what I'm doing now.
Can you speak to the distinction between getting your own therapy versus formal supervision?
Yeah,
Thank you.
for sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with the idea again that supervision has therapeutic elements, but is not therapy. So when we're in supervision and I'm working with a client, supervisee, and maybe we're sort of starting to verge into that therapeutic world where we may be talking about use of self, countertransference, I'm always mindful about how is this going to help the client? How is this going to come back to the client to enhance that supervisor or the clinical relationship, the therapeutic work, and that type of thing. So that can mean sometimes that we do get into some more personal stuff. But I'm always mindful as a supervisor that I'm not the therapist. I'm only going to go so far as it relates to the clinical work. And I build that into my contract as well to say, let's give each other permission that if it's feeling like this is getting too personal for either of us, that we halt the conversation and say, it's time for you to go to your journal, your therapist, your reading to work on that piece of it. When it's therapy, it's all about you. Right? It's not about the client, right? So if I'm providing therapy for someone, it's that unconditional positive regard. I'm talking about their goals, their work. It's not about clinical work at all. And when I have these different hats on, for a client, on another adage, you go for the emotion, right? If there's tears, if there's anger, that's what you're curious about. You're asking about that. If there's a supervisee and they're crying, I will be very mindful about, do I ask another question there? I'll ask. I see that you're upset, or I see that something's happening. How is this feeling? Is this going to work for supervision? Is this getting too personal? I've had a supervisee who really struggled with feelings of incompetence, which is very common for new people, newer clinicians. And she just we couldn't get past it. She ended up quitting the placement because it was so distressing for her to be working with clients. And there was sort of this time where I could see that I could ask therapeutic questions to talk about what happened, that these things are here. How could we work with this? But that was outside of my scope of practice. When I was doing my more formal supervision training, the person that was doing the training, I don't know if I agree with this rule, but this is what she told us. She worked at a trauma treatment center, and she said if a personal issue came up 3 times in supervision, on the 3rd time, supervision ends until the person gets their own therapy. So I know some eyebrows are up and like, that's That's pretty intense. But I think that just speaks to the difference there. And absolutely, personal stuff does come up all the time. That's our work. But there's a difference there. Supervision is about the client. Therapy is about them.
Would you be able to highlight a few moments where there might be a conflict of interest, where you might decline to supervise somebody, or it might not be appropriate for you to be their supervisor?
Sure. So like some easy ones would be if they are wanting supervision in a paradigm that I'm not familiar with. So that would be kind of pretty clear. Or if they do a lot of work with kids or within a certain cultural group that I don't have experience with, I would, wonder with them if I'm the best fit and would refer on to some other places as well. The supervisor relationship is interesting in terms of conflict of interest because it's not the clinical relationship. So within a clinical relationship, it's very much contained. I'm only using self-disclosure in a very judicial way to enhance the therapy, and I won't, the boundaries are very clear. And so like, if I see them out in public, which happens sometimes, my rule, I'm sure many of us have the same rule, I don't approach them. If they say hi to me, that's fine, but I will not, we maintain confidentiality. So all that, I'm leading up to this idea that the conflict of interest might look a little bit different with a supervisor, like if they're hiring me. But I always would encourage first some self-reflection, like if there is sort of a dual relationship or a conflict of interest, for me as a supervisor to say, do I feel comfortable with this? What could be the problems here? Would I be able to do good work here? Similarly, ask, the supervisee, how are you feeling about this dual relationship? We might see each other at the party later or whatever and work from there. And then maybe even have a more open conversation about how to, what will it be like when we see you later? That definition that I gave of supervision, it does extend over time. And it's really common I know I do in other places, you have a great student, well, you hire them because they're a great student. And then that relationship changes. I took my last student out for lunch recently. I would never do that with a client. So the relationship is different by nature. And so that question of dual relationship and conflict of interest, I think you just sort of have to look at it. It doesn't have the same sort of parameters as a clinical relationship.
A logistical question.
Mm.
How do you decide or determine how much to charge for a session? So is there a standard, and what might be the standard length of time for sessions?
Interesting question. No, there's no standard. That could be something that someone works on. And I think maybe kind of broader to that point is what I'm seeing right now within the private world of social work and counseling and psychotherapy is that there are very broad ranges of prices that people are charging, very, very broad, from $45 a session to $230 a session for an RP, even an RPQ I've seen. So it's pretty broad. I look at the market so I can, thanks to Google and ChatGPT and maybe my bank a little bit, you can sort of get a sense of what people are typically charging. And so I kind of look around and think about my experience and think about what other people are charging, and that's how I make my price point. So it's not based on not based on anything other than sort of what I think might be fair. And I let it slide, right? If I'm working with a student, I've hired 2 of my students and hired them on. I'm not charging for them for supervision. But if someone else is coming, we sort of talk about it and find something that works.
And then we have time for one more question.
Okay.
This is quite a specific question. So, what might count as hours for clinical supervision? So, for example, that's required to supervise an RP. Would MSW practicum hours, peer supervision, or consultation count?
So could you ask that again? What counts as supervisory hours?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to defer because I'm guessing that's from someone looking at the CRPO. I would talk to them. I don't know exactly I would imagine it would be, sitting with bringing a case and having an hour with a supervisee, but I don't know exactly. So talk to the CRPO or some people in this room. Yeah.
When in doubt, you can send an email to the CRPO's professional practice
That's
department.
right. And they may or may not get back to you because they're very busy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Thomas. That's
Yeah.
all the time we have. I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to us from such a place of honesty
Sure.
and integrity. As a registrant myself, I've really appreciated your vulnerability in presenting yourself and your pathway as a case scenario in service of our learning and growth. And there was so much here for us to consider and reflect on regarding not only private practice and supervision, but everything throughout our careers. So thank you so much. If we can all thank Thomas for his time and
Thank you all.
efforts.
Thanks for having me. Thanks very much.